They said there wasn't enough space at the table that year, so they placed a folding chair for me in the garden, under the plum tree. I could still hear their laughter through the windows, but not once did anyone look out to see if I was cold. If this story touches something tender inside you, dear heart, feel free to leave a comment or subscribe. Sometimes the softest voices carry the deepest echoes. It was Thanksgiving, though you wouldn't have known it from where I sat. The garden was damp with the hush of late November, and the plum tree, bare and brittle, arched over me like a forgotten umbrella. They gave me a thin blanket and a lukewarm plate. Said they'd be right out, just a little tight in the dining room this year with all the cousins and partners. I smiled and nodded, as I've done all my life, and I watched the candlelight flicker behind the curtains while my tea grew cold. It was a quiet betrayal. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just the subtle way a life once central becomes background. Like when your favorite mug is pushed to the back of the cupboard because it has a chip. Still beautiful, still usable, just not the one they reach for anymore. I remember picking that plum tree myself. It was barely a sapling when Harold and I planted it after moving in, our boys still toddling around the yard, tripping over their own joy. We thought it would bloom into something lasting, and it did, though not in the ways I expected. I sat there under its gnarled branches, my lap full of crumbs and old thoughts. The voices from inside drifted out, clinking glasses, bursts of laughter, a chorus of belonging that I'd once led, but now could only overhear. I didn't cry. It's funny. I don't cry much anymore, not because I'm strong, because I've simply grown used to the stillness, the kind of stillness that settles in your chest like dust on an untouched photo frame. You begin to wonder if the dust is protecting the memory or erasing it. A breeze rustled the branches above, and one last plum leaf twirled its way down onto my plate. I smiled at that. A small kindness from the tree, and that's when it started. A line formed in my mind, like the start of a poem I hadn't meant to write. Under branches bare, I sat unseen, a mother's grace, gone evergreen. I whispered it into the cold. It felt strange, putting words to that ache, but also freeing. The garden had become my quiet room, the chair beneath the plum tree, my confessional. And though no one asked me to speak, I began to write anyway. On napkins, receipts, the back of a grocery list tucked in my coat. It didn't matter if no one read them. They were mine, little offerings to a life that had gone quiet. And I suppose that's how it all began, not with a scream, but with a sentence, a whisper beneath a tree, a leaf landing where love once lived. You don't set out to disappear. It happens slowly, like fog rolling in, not all at once, but so quietly you forget the sun was ever shining. I was 19 when I married Harold. He had a crooked smile and calloused hands, and he called me Sunflower, even though I was more dandelion than daisy. We didn't have much. A one-bedroom apartment above a bakery, where the scent of fresh bread became the perfume of our early years. It was enough. When the boys came, first Jonah, then Peter, I gave myself to them like morning light through a nursery window. Every hour, every heartbeat, I stitched into the hems of their lives. Lunches cut into shapes, bedtime songs sung through exhaustion, birthday cakes with lopsided frosting and little hand-drawn treasure maps for Christmas mornings. I was the keeper of memories no one remembered, the background hum that made everything else sing, and I never minded, not really. Harold worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, and I understood. And that was love then, understanding without needing it returned. He didn't bring home flowers or poetry, but I knew the look in his eyes when he fixed the porch light without me asking. That was his way. I remember one winter, we had no money for gifts, So I made the boys sock puppets from old shirts and buttons. Jonah cried when his fell apart the second day. Peter just tossed his in the toy chest. They never knew I stayed up until 3 sewing them by candlelight, pricking my fingers raw. But that's motherhood, isn't it? You don't count the stitches. You just hope they hold. As they grew, the needs changed, but never stopped. College applications, car troubles, first heartbreaks. I was the midnight call, the emergency contact, the hand on their backs when the world felt too heavy. And when Harold got sick, I became nurse, driver, cook, companion. His eyes grew dim toward the end, but sometimes he'd reach out and say, "You're still here?" And I'd smile, even though the question stung. Of course I was still here. I'd never left. After he passed, the boys came around less. Jonah moved to Chicago. Peter married a woman who never looked me in the eyes. I told myself they were busy, important, that I'd raised them to be independent, and this was my reward. But I often sat by the window, watching the driveway stay empty. It was around then I began to fade, not in body, but in presence. I became the forgotten thread in a well-worn sweater. You don't notice it until it unravels. I still cooked big meals, out of habit. Still kept the house spotless in case someone just stopped by. But fewer coats hung by the door. Fewer voices filled the hall. I didn't blame them. That's the hardest part. When you ache, but understand. Love, I've learned, doesn't always come back the way you send it out. Sometimes it returns in echoes. Other times, not at all. But I kept showing up, kept lighting the candles, folding the towels just the way they liked. Because somewhere in the quiet, I still believed I mattered. And then came that Thanksgiving, that cold chair, that final unspoken confirmation that I had become optional. And yet, that evening beneath the plum tree, something stirred, a flicker of the girl who once wrote poems on napkins, before life asked her to be everything for everyone else. Perhaps it wasn't too late to remember her, to find what had been buried beneath years of sacrifice, to breathe again, not for others, but for myself. It was a Tuesday afternoon, about a week after Thanksgiving. The leftover cranberry sauce was still sitting in my fridge, untouched. I remember because I opened the lid, thinking I'd throw it out. But instead, I just stood there, staring at it. That little glass dish, filled with something no one finished, somehow looked exactly like how I felt. That day, I received a group text from Peter's wife, Marla. She had taken over the family logistics, as she called it. Her message was practical, efficient, and utterly hollow. "Hey everyone. We're starting a rotation for Sunday dinners. Jonah's bringing the salad this week. I'll handle the main. Can someone check if Mom can just do dessert? Something light? Or store-bought is fine." There was no, "Hi, Mom," no warmth, just, "Store-bought is fine." Like my years of pies and cobblers, of hands dusted in flour and cinnamon-smudged aprons, had evaporated into insignificance. Store-bought was fine. It hit me harder than I expected. I sat down in the kitchen chair, the one with the cushion Harold used to call her throne, and stared at my hands. These hands had kneaded dough when they ached, held children through fevers, washed, cooked, mended, and built a life from scratch. And now they were being asked to do less, to not bother, to fade. Later that evening, I placed my hands on the table and wrote another line. They ask for less of me, not knowing I've already given all. I didn't cry, but there was something in my chest, a quiet crumbling, like the soft collapse of an old sponge cake when you open the oven too soon. I felt hollow. That night, I wandered out into the garden again. The wind had picked up, and the last of the plum leaves were now just a memory on the ground. I sat in the chair, the wood creaking gently beneath me, and pulled a cardigan tight across my chest. There was no sound but the rustling, no visitors, no invitations, just me, and the quiet acknowledgement that I was no longer needed the way I used to be. It's a strange grief, the kind that doesn't come with funerals or condolences. No one sends flowers when a mother's usefulness dies. I began collecting scraps, old receipts, unused envelopes, the backs of catalogs. I'd write tiny verses in the margins like whispers trying to keep me company. They passed the bread without looking. I once baked their world from scratch. Sometimes I hid them in drawers. Other times I left them in plain sight. No one noticed. Until one day someone did. It was a Tuesday again. Same soft light through the window. Same dull ache. But this time I heard a voice at the garden gate. "Excuse me, are you the lady who sits under the tree?" I turned. There she was, Emma, the girl next door, 8, maybe 9, with scuffed sneakers and the courage only children carry. "I saw you once. I thought you looked like a story." I blinked. No one had looked at me like that in years. I nodded. "Maybe I am." She smiled, held out a paper napkin. "You dropped this last week. It had a poem on it. I read it twice." I took it gently from her hand. It was one I had written without thought, but to her it had meant something, and something inside me softened, like the first thaw of frost on an early spring morning. There are moments in a woman's life when silence feels safer than speaking. I had lived most of mine between the lines, between what I felt and what I dared to say. But that night, after Emma's small gesture, the silence inside me began to crack. I sat in the garden longer than usual, even after the air turned sharp with winter's breath. The chair beneath the plum tree creaked like an old friend exhaling beside me. For the first time in years, I let myself ask a question I had tucked away for too long. Was it all meaningless? Not the big things, birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. Those are easy to remember. But the everyday sacrifices, the mornings I rose before dawn to iron Harold's shirts, the evenings I sat with Jonah through algebra, even though math made me anxious, the dinners I cooked from recipes I learned just because Peter's wife once said she liked Moroccan food. Where did those moments go? Do they live on in anyone's memory but mine? Sometimes I wondered if I had mistaken being useful for being loved, if the affection I received had been more about what I did than who I was. And now that I was no longer needed in the same ways, I feared I had become invisible, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't see me anymore. That was the ache, not anger, not bitterness, just a longing to be known, fully, quietly, still. I went to my old sewing drawer that night and pulled out a bundle of papers, napkins, receipts, scraps of forgotten lists, every little poem I'd written since that Thanksgiving evening. I laid them out on the table in rows like tiny broken windows into my heart. Emma's face came to mind, that child with her messy hair and open eyes, saying I looked like a story. Perhaps I was, and perhaps it wasn't too late to tell it. The next morning I taped a few poems to the fence post by the plum tree. No fanfare, no signatures, just my words, fluttering gently in the breeze like forgotten prayers. I didn't expect anything, but at least I had said something. To the sky, to the garden, to myself. Then, a few days later, I found a note at the base of the tree, in careful, blocky handwriting. I like the one about the bread. Can you write one about snow? Emma. My breath caught. It felt like someone had reached into the well of me and found water, not just cracked stone or dust, but something still living. So I did. Snow falls like memory, soft and uninvited, but beautiful when you stop running from it. I folded the poem, placed it under a small rock, and left it by the tree. That was how it began, a quiet exchange, a whisper between generations. I didn't know it then, but that chair, my exile, was becoming something else. It was no longer the place where I had been placed to be forgotten. It was becoming the place where I chose to remember myself. That realization, soft, slow, and undeniable, was more powerful than any apology I had waited for. I didn't need to be invited back to the table. I was building a table of my own. Emma began stopping by almost every other afternoon, always with something in her hands, a cookie she'd baked with her mother, a crayon drawing of the tree, or sometimes just a question that had taken root in her young mind. And always she'd ask, "Did you write another one?" At first I hesitated. I hadn't thought of myself as a writer, certainly not a poet. I was just an old woman with a head full of feelings and nowhere to place them. Until now. But Emma didn't see me the way the others did. She didn't glance past me, or speak to me like I was someone's mother, or someone's chore. She looked directly at me, curious and open, as though I was the beginning of a sentence she couldn't wait to hear. One afternoon I read her a poem aloud. My voice was thin at first, rusty from disuse, but steady. Autumn sits heavy in my bones, not from age, but from the echoes of footsteps that no longer lead to my door. Emma sat cross-legged in the grass, eyes wide. When I finished, she clapped her hands against her knees and said, "That's so good. You should write a book. You're like a real poet." I smiled, but something in me tightened. No one had called me anything like that before. Not poet, not real. Most of my life had been spent being everything but myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. The word kept floating through my mind. Poet. Could it be true? I gathered the small collection I'd hidden away in shoeboxes and drawers. There were dozens, some messy, some delicate, some barely legible from smudged ink or old tears. But they were mine, my voice, my seasons. I placed them into a binder with plastic sleeves, alphabetizing nothing, just grouping them by feeling. Autumn poems, kitchen poems, chair poems, holiday poems that hurt to write. The next day, Emma came bounding through the garden gate, cheeks pink from the wind. Before she could ask, I handed her the binder. "This," I said, "is my heart. Be gentle." She opened it slowly, reverently, like it was something sacred. And as she turned the pages, her mouth formed the words, her little voice lifting my lines into the air like birds startled from a tree. We made a ritual of it after that. She'd bring her pink blanket and her hot chocolate, and we'd sit under the plum tree as she read. Sometimes she'd stumble, ask me what a word meant, or tell me which ones made her feel warm inside. One day she looked up and asked, "Can I help you fix the ones that don't rhyme? That's what editors do." I laughed. It had been so long since I'd laughed like that, free and full. "Well then," I said, "I suppose I've just hired my first editor." And just like that, Emma became more than a neighbor's daughter. She became my co-dreamer, my bridge, my little spark of hope. She didn't know all I had lost, or how deeply I had been erased by the world I once built. But somehow, she saw what was left and called it beautiful. And maybe that was the beginning of healing, not in being remembered for what I did, but in being seen for who I had always quietly been. The word poet stopped feeling foreign after a while. Emma had written it in purple marker on a piece of construction paper and taped it to the fence. "This is Mrs. Wren. She is a poet." I left it there. It fluttered in the breeze like a flag I had never dared raise for myself. And then, one day, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I printed out 3 of my poems on fresh white paper, slid them into an envelope, and walked, yes, walked, to the library. The community board near the entrance had flyers for babysitters, piano lessons, and a watercolor club. I pinned mine underneath them, almost trembling, my heart thudding like it did when I was 17 and danced in public for the first time. Seasonal poetry readings in the garden Sundays at 3 p.m. under the plum tree. All ages welcome. Bring tea or a poem of your own. I didn't tell the boys. I didn't expect anyone from inside the house to notice. This wasn't for them. It was for me. That first Sunday, I set out a few folding chairs and some paper cups. Emma brought chocolate chip cookies and wore a beret she said made her look like a real Paris poet. We waited. No one came. Well, no one except a cat that slept through the entire hour, and Emma, who insisted on reading every poem twice. And you know what? It was perfect, because I had chosen to be there, not out of obligation or habit or someone else's needs. I showed up for me. The next Sunday, 2 older women from the neighborhood stopped by, curious. They brought lemon bars and sat quietly as I read about the aching quiet of December. The week after, a teenager came with his guitar and asked if he could play while I read, and I said yes. Of course, yes. Something was growing here, something gentle, a gathering not built on blood, but on shared stillness. They didn't ask if I'd ever been important. They didn't care if I had a title or a diploma, or if my poems had been published. They just listened, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was speaking into the world, not just at it. I still remember the moment everything shifted, when I finally believed it. A woman, maybe my age, stayed after one Sunday. She held one of my printed poems in her hands, folded gently like something fragile. She said, "This one." It felt like someone had been watching my life and writing it down. And that's when I knew what I had lived, quietly and painfully, had not been meaningless. It had been witnessed, even if only now, and that mattered. I went inside that evening, looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. The same soft face I'd stopped really seeing years ago, and I whispered, "You were never invisible. You were just waiting, waiting for the right light, the right chair, the right ears." There's a sound I'll never forget. The soft rustling of folding chairs being set out on a Sunday afternoon, not by me, but by others. It started with just a few neighbors, widows, young mothers, quiet souls who said they'd just listen. But something in the garden changed as weeks passed. Word spread, not loudly, not virally, just gently, hand to hand, heart to heart. Soon there were blankets on the lawn, thermoses of tea, notebook pages folded and trembling in the hands of women who hadn't spoken their truth aloud in years, and girls, sweet, bright-eyed girls, who watched and listened and learned that being soft didn't mean being small. They called it the Sunday Corner. Not my name, theirs. One of the teenage girls, Lila, made a chalkboard sign that she hung on the fence every Saturday evening. Poetry under the plum tree, tomorrow at 3. Some read from journals, some just came to sit, but all of us, in our own way, found a space to exhale. One Sunday, as I read a piece about winter and grief, I looked up to find Peter standing at the back. He was holding a grocery bag. Inside it, a tart he'd baked from a boxed mix. He waited until the reading ended, then walked up slowly. Marla's with her mother today. I thought I'd stop by. Emma invited me." I hadn't known she'd done that. He looked around the garden, at the women with tear-lined cheeks and soft smiles, at the little chalkboard and the cup of pens by the tree. "I didn't know you were doing all this, Mom." I smiled softly. "I didn't know I was either." We didn't say much more. He sat in the back that day, just listened. But that evening he called Jonah, and the Sunday after, Jonah came too. They brought folding chairs, unprompted, helped pick up wrappers, even sat on the grass with the younger girls and asked them what poems they liked best. Something was shifting. Not everything, not overnight, but enough to feel it in my bones. One afternoon I found Marla kneeling under the plum tree, tracing her fingers over a poem Emma had laminated and hung from a branch. It read, "You don't need a stage to be seen, just one open heart beneath a tree." Marla stood when she saw me and said, "I didn't realize how lonely you must have been. We thought you were fine." I didn't need her to say it all. Some wounds don't close with words, but with time, with being seen, with being invited back into the light. Later that week, Emma handed me a thick manila folder. Inside were typed versions of all my poems, organized, edited, beautiful. "I want to help you make a book," she said, eyes shining. "You can call it whatever you want, but I think it should be The Forgotten Seasons, because none of them should be forgotten." My throat tightened. This little girl had given me something no one had in decades, not pity, not duty, but belief. And in that garden, under a tree whose branches once held silence, I began to bloom again. The chair under the plum tree has worn grooves now, soft indents where I've sat through changing skies and shifting seasons. Its paint is chipped, its wood faded, but it cradles me like something sacred. Once a place of quiet exile, it has become a sanctuary, a pulpit, a porch for my soul. I still remember the day the book arrived, a small box on the porch, stamped with Emma's eager handwriting, author, copies, Mrs. Wren, poet. I held the first copy in my hands like it might float away. The Forgotten Seasons, my name printed softly at the bottom. Each page held a memory, a breath, a moment I thought had died quietly in me. But here they were, bound, alive. Emma insisted on hosting a little book release that Sunday. She and her mother baked cupcakes and hung string lights around the garden. The plum tree was just starting to bud again, shy pink blossoms trembling in the late spring breeze. Neighbors came, some I'd known for decades, some I'd only met in the garden's gentle circle. Even a local librarian stopped by, asking if we'd consider a reading downtown. I stood in the center of it all, a bit overwhelmed, a bit in awe. Peter was there too. He had brought a small bouquet, lavender and rosemary from my own backyard. He kissed my cheek and said, "I read it, Mom. All of it. I had no idea you were carrying so much." I looked at him then, not as my son, but as someone still learning how to see me, and that was enough. Jonah came the next week, bringing my first grandchild, an 8-month-old with my eyes and Harold's dimple. She gurgled when I read a gentle spring poem, clapping as if she understood every word. That's when it struck me. This was no longer about me being forgotten. It was about me choosing what to leave behind. And so, every Sunday, I leave something behind under the plum tree, a poem, a story, a seat. The old chair has become a ritual, not just mine anymore. Women come to sit with their journals. Girls trace words in the dirt. And sometimes, even the men just come to listen, to the breeze, to the lines, to the lives they had never asked to hear before. No one says, "You're just a mom" anymore. No one says, "Store-bought is fine." Instead, I hear, "Your poem made me cry." Can I bring my sister next week? My daughter wants to write too. That chair, once a symbol of quiet dismissal, is now a monument to quiet becoming. And me? I no longer wait for a seat at their table. I've built one under the open sky, beside a tree that remembers every word I've spoken to it. When the wind moves through the branches, I sometimes imagine its herald, chuckling softly, calling me his sunflower. Once more, I look out at the garden, full of stories, and I finally feel it in my bones. I was never invisible. I was simply growing in the shade, and now, with every verse, every shared breath, I bloom, even in winter, even now,